below ground organization and such by Ricardo this morning.
Okay, so yeah, I thought at least some of you could be interested in learning a little bit about this work that we are doing, mostly because it's in between two scales that we've discussed a lot. We've discussed a lot about root development, single root development and branching, genetic regulation of root growth. We've discussed massive scales, like self-organized ecosystems of vegetation dynamics, and I thought it could be interesting if I were able to jump in and somehow share with you a little bit of the work that we are doing in between those two scales. So by bridging these two scales, I don't mean that what you are going to see contains, yes, thank you, contains elements of both scales. It actually does not contain elements of any of the scales specifically, but I think it's still an interesting conceptual bridge. And I also wanted to share with you how we arrived to this point, which is from the larger scale. So I did quite some work on vegetation pattern formation during my PhD, a little bit during my postdoc, although we never finished anything. And then I was a little bit puzzled by the models that we used to study vegetation pattern formation in drylands, and that's when we started this project. Just to give you a little bit of motivation on why, if you are interested in patterns, it's interesting to maybe take a step back and look at interactions. Let me give a little bit summary of all the existing ways in which you can model vegetation patterns. And I would say patterns in general. So we've been exposed a lot to PDE-based patterns, I guess we all agree on that. There are other ways on modeling patterns, which I sometimes have conflicting feelings about which one I find more appealing. I think both. So I wanted to also share this broader view with you. No? So probably if you are thinking about plant patterns, the first type of model that you would try to do would be one in which every plant is a point. To me, it's a little bit of a stretch to start thinking about plants in terms of reaction diffusion equations, right? It's like there is one step to get there, which is coarse graining individual plants, no? And that is a lot of interesting questions, in my opinion. Just looking at vegetation patterns, for example, the spot patterns that some of you are working in the group, and asking the question of how many plants do I have in these spots? That's, in my opinion, that's an extremely relevant ecological question, and it's a question that PDE models cannot answer, right? You can know how much biomass you have, but you don't know if that biomass comes from 7 plants or from 1 plant, and that is ecologically extremely important. It tells you a lot of things about the mechanisms that are forming that pattern, and it tells you many things about the functioning of the ecosystem because of that pattern. And that's information we for sure miss when we have PDE-based models. IBMs are interesting because you can track individual identities. These IBM models are usually spatially extended stochastic processes, very similar to the ones that Nigel introduced in his lecture. They are harder to trick mathematically. That's one reason why the whole vegetation pattern community in the 90s more or less drifted towards PDE models instead of keeping this kind of approach, which was the one that, let's say, triggered the field. There are some things you can do. One of them is all the field theoretical approaches that Nigel introduced last week. You can also do what is called a spatial moment approximation, which is something that mathematical biologists love, and theoretical physicists don't like that much because it relies on very strong assumptions on the way you treat spatial correlations. And what is more important, the results that you get at the end depend a lot on the assumptions that you make about these, the way you treat these spatial correlations. So just to give you a little bit of an intuition on how this spatial moment dynamics works is when you create your spatial pattern, you have a cloud of points, and you can treat this as a spatial distribution of points, no? It's a point pattern. And then you can write dynamical equations for the mean density of points, where you don't have any information about the spatial structure of the ecosystem. But the problem is because your ecosystem is, your dynamics is non-linear, the density of plants is going to depend on the correlations, on the spatial correlations. So if you treat the density, I mean, if the density is the first moment of this pattern, then it will depend on the second moment, which is the one that contains the spatial correlations. It's kind of intuitive, right? If I have plants that are closer to each other and my rates depend on the distance, it's going to affect how the total number of plants changes. The problem is that because my system is highly nonlinear, when I write the equation for this second moment, it's going to depend on the third moment as well, and so on and so forth. And at the end, you have an infinite set of equations coupled with each other, and the only way you can treat it is by truncating it. And the problem is that the results that you get give you some intuition. Sometimes they work, but how well they work depends on this truncation, on this moment closure approximation that you do. And that is a little bit tricky. But you can see, for example, in this plot that you have here, that the approximation works quite well. So this is a very simple simulation of a birth-death process where plants die with a rate that depends on the local density of plants. It's the simplest plant model that you can think of. It was introduced by Ben Volker and Steve Pacala in the '97. And basically, what you see in the blue dots is the raw numerical simulation. So I do a lot of simulations and I count how many plants I have, and I calculate the mean and the variance. If you do a mean field approximation, which would mean that whenever I write the equation for the mean density of plants, I truncate it at the correlation level. I don't look at this. I do an approximation that consists on neglecting spatial correlations. Then I get the flat line that you see, which makes sense, right? It does not depend on the dispersal scale. It does not depend on the spatial dynamics because I'm neglecting the spatial correlations. And I'm still capturing a lot of interesting behaviors related to the effects of space. If I go one step further in my approximation, then I can recover this trend with the spatial density, with the dispersal scale. This is nice. The problem is that if you start building complexity in these models, things start getting like super sketchy and it's kind of complicated. But it's an interesting thing to know, and to know that they exist. Not all patterns are based on PDs. So if you just take this message and now switch off your brains, at least we have one key message from the first 10 minutes, which I think is pretty nice. But of course, there are continuum PD-based models that I'm not going to say I don't like them. I think they're very helpful. They are very interesting. Basically, they describe the density of biomass, of plants, and sometimes also water, how they interact with each other. And by doing that, you lose the identity of individuals. That's what I meant when I told you this initial question of how many plants do I have in these spots. I cannot do that anymore. But people have used it to do a lot of interesting things because they are easily to treat mathematically. If you are an expert, or you can learn all these nonlinear spatial dynamical systems, and then you can get many intuitions. For example, we have this picture that was shown a couple of times already, especially during the first week, where people were able to relate somehow pattern shape with amount of water, and then it opened a lot of discussion on, the shape of the pattern is going to tell me whether my system is closer to a desert or not. I'm going to both show you stuff and also from time to time give you my personal take on these things, and then maybe we can discuss more. I plan this to be like a more relaxed kind of thing. I'm not going to use the Blackboard beyond writing a few averages there. In my opinion, there was a huge explosion of this idea. In my opinion, too much. It was overexploited by some people like me that were not so knowledgeable on pattern formation theory, and that gave some contradictions and some results that were a little bit not so well established. But there is many things that we can do beyond looking at pattern formation in these spatially extended models. And this is work from Ehud Meron's group in Israel, where they propose that when you have the front or the frontier between a desert and a vegetation system, just fluctuations in this front could destabilize this frontier, and somehow, depending on how this instability works, these could lead to a recovery of the desert. So basically, what you see here is that this front becomes unstable, there is this finger instability, and then the fingers start invading the desert state. It's a very interesting proposal to think about how vegetation could invade, let's say, a desert area. I discussed this paper, I remember, with a lot of proper field ecologists, and they were shocked by how we as modelers were thinking that vegetation could create these fingers and invade a desert. So it's these kind of ideas give a lot of interesting interactions between field ecologists and modelers that I think are really, really helpful. And something else that we can do with these PDs is to look at other types of spatial dynamics, for example, traveling waves, and see whether the patterns that we have are stationary, whether they move on space, whether they don't. And this is something that David here in the audience has done a lot of work during his PhD, and also on front now he's going to tell you a little bit after. So that is, for instance, a key idea, no? That there was a lot of work on patterns, but all these processes that may also sound more realistic, like, I don't know, I have a front of vegetation and desert, which is the direction it's going to take, sounds more reasonable, at least to me, when I think in terms of desertification dynamics. Anyway, going back to this idea of a lot of work on patterns and focusing on this result, the problem with that result is that this kind of bifurcation diagram with the hysteresis loop and showing that the spot pattern was the last step before we lose all vegetation got a lot of attention. It's really interesting, not to say, whenever I have spots, I'm very close to the desert. And this is extremely relevant and extremely dangerous, because then the desertification is going to be abrupt. It's going to be sudden. I don't see a continuous degradation of my ecosystem. I have a tipping point. And it's even worse, because then I have a hysteresis loop. And to recover this ecosystem is going to take a lot of work. I really need to improve the environmental conditions a lot. So this was a very interesting idea for theoreticians. So what is the problem that I found with these models when I started, when I started in my PhD? The problem is that you get this from reaction diffusion equations, water vegetation models, but you can also come up with a completely different model in which you have this same correlation between precipitation and patterns, but the bifurcation is very different. And that depends a lot on the structure of your equations. And this is already 10 years old, this argument that I'm going to build with you, and has been refined since, and it's more elaborate. But basically, the key point that I want to make comparing these two diagrams here is that Turing patterns are very general. If they basically, you will have Turing patterns wherever you have a model that has a Turing stability, right? And then what made this idea of the tipping point is not, it is too much of an overstatement linking the existence of Turing patterns to tipping points. And that's something that people started realizing a long time ago. This is not something new, and it's not something I came up with. Actually, there is some newer work with people that are experts on this, on PDEs, where they actually found that whenever you have these kind of systems, these kind of models, the bifurcation of the patterns, the Turing point, which is the value of your parameter at which the patterns branch from the uniform solution, can be before the tipping point, and then you have a whole region of solutions where your ecosystem can move and avoid the tipping point. Just because here you are destabilizing the uniform solution, and when you have patterns, you enter into all this region where you have multi-stability, and then as you move the environmental conditions, then the pattern will readapt, reshape, and things can be very, very different. How you will move in this region, for example, will depend on the speed at which the environmental conditions change. If the precipitation declines very fast, the pattern is going to not be able to track, if you want, this environmental change, and you may lose the vegetation. But if the environmental changes are smooth, then you may be moving across this Busa balloon, which is this purple bubble that you have here, and then the ecosystem may respond more smoothly. And this is something that people came up with exact results. This is theoretical results. It's not simulations. Then last year there was, 3 years ago already, time flies, there was this review perspective paper in Science where they proposed that this idea of the booster balloon could be just a smaller picture of something way more general. And this is a figure that I think that Johan also showed in his lectures, where basically they claim that whenever you have a space, you have a lot of multi-stability in your system, and perturbations can be localized. You may lose vegetation in some point of the space, doesn't need to propagate all over the system, and the systems are extremely complex. So basically the take-home message from this cartoon, this is a cartoon, this is an idea, it's a proposal, it's a perspective, is that whenever you have a space, you have nasty spatial dynamics that can lead to a way more complex things than these two things. So this is more or less how, in the last 15 years, 20 years maybe, the community of vegetation pattern formation in drylands has evolved their thinking from these simple bifurcation diagrams where you have tipping points or not tipping points. Well, actually, it would be too much of an overstatement saying that this belongs to the community. This is my result, and this was clearly accepted by the community. This is just for you to have a comparison. So basically, we've evolved from this picture where we had the idea of ecosystems exhibiting tipping points and being able to lose all the vegetation towards this way more complex picture where we really need to understand the spatial dynamics. The problem is that to understand these spatial dynamics and to know how things are going to happen in a space, you need to know what are the equations that you have in your model. So I think it's a little bit tricky to propose phenomenological models like the ones that you've seen last week where I say, I have this nonlinearity, I have a positive feedback, so here I put some quadratic term that makes the job, when we know already that our bifurcation diagrams are going to be so sensitive to what I put in the model. And that's when we started thinking about how can we understand below ground interactions in plants. Why below ground? Because we were very interested in, first of all, understanding how plants compete for resources under the soil, in the soil. We found it a way more interesting question because it's really hard to see below ground stuff. No, it's not so easy to see how roots grow. Besides studying pattern formation, which was my main motivation, below ground dynamics is extremely important for many, many reasons. Some of them came up during your questions. For example, to better understand how cultivars may grow. To be honest, linking this idea of studying below ground interactions to pattern formation, 95% of plant biologists and ecologists will think it's a horrible motivation to study this. Is the less important way, the less important question you can answer with this kind of frameworks is vegetation patterns. It's the one I was interested in, and it's how I arrived, but there are way, way more interesting questions that you can address with that, which I found really cool to learn about. It's also very important to know how much biomass ecosystems allocate below ground. Yes? Which questions can you address? For example, understanding how can you distribute in a space cultivars so they give you more food. It's also important to have better informed models of how much biomass plants allocate below ground to address questions related to carbon sequestration in ecosystems, how these ecosystems are going to respond to climate change. And this is my take, sorry. I should put it in a lower color. But the key point, the key bottleneck that we found when we started asking these questions was that because it's so hard to see things below ground, there is no so many data sets where we can have intact root systems to study root architecture, especially when you have plants in interaction. That was the key lack of data, if you wish. Of course, we were not the first ones that were interested in this question from a theoretical and an empirical point of view. And there was two ways of looking at this problem before we started. When we did our literature review, that's something you all should do when you start working on a project, we found that people were mainly looking at this question from two angles. One is what I like to call the spatial angle, or the spatial approach, in which people were really interested in understanding how far plants grow their roots. People were doing this, doing experiments and a little bit of statistical modeling, and the experiments were basically trying to measure the extension of root systems when plants grow alone and when they are in crowded communities. So I go out there and I try to delimitate the space in which plants are allocating their roots. I construct some polygons by just limiting these areas, and then I try to compare the overlap between these polygons with a null model in which I assume that plants are throwing their root systems randomly. What they found is that the actual data set of root overlap has a lower overlap than a random model, a significantly lower overlap than a random model. This means that when plants compete, they tend to segregate. They tend to avoid each other. They are territorial, if you want, in terms of maybe jargon that it may resonate a little bit more with you. This is nice. We know that they try to avoid each other. Makes sense. If we are competing for resources, I I better not go into fight with you and just keep my stuff safe. But there is then a whole set of experiments that I found really, really cool, and is what I like to call the biomass approach, in which people were not looking at the space at all. They were just looking at biomass allocation. So how much biomass do I produce as a plant when I grow alone and when I grow with a neighbor? Here, the literature is a little bit more, and you can interrupt me at any point if you have questions. Here, so the question that Mahati had is how are these polygons defined? The answer is that basically you go to the field and you try to track the root system and then try to delimit it when you stop seeing roots from a plant. You have some error because the thin roots, it's hard, there is messy stuff around, but it's hard. It's really hard to, I'm going to tell you how we did that. I'm not saying it's better or worse, but for our method, I have more details. Anyway, so what you see now in the screen is an experiment that is from 2001, where people did this very interesting thing of growing plants alone in pots or sharing pots with a neighbor. And then they measured the amount of root that they produced. What they found is that plants, when they grow in interaction, they produce more roots than when they grow alone. So basically, they tend to overproduce roots just because of the competition with their neighbors. It's kind of a, if you want to think in terms of maybe a bit of a game theoretical approach, it's like there is this plant that is taking resources from the soil, and that forces me to allocate more biomass and to take resources from the soil because the conditions are getting worse faster, let's say, no? And then you enter into this kind of fight to see who takes more resources that at the end takes you to an equilibrium in which you allocate a lot of biomass into your root system. This is somehow leads to what, for some of you may be familiar, a tragedy of the commons. So you are allocating a lot of resources into over-exploiting a resource, and at the end you are in a suboptimal resource intake strategy, which is pretty bad. But the interesting thing is that there is another set of experimental results in which they found the opposite. They found that when plants grow in pairs, they allocate less roots than when they grow alone. They underproduce roots. So this is already interesting. This is the best thing that you can find as someone interested in constructing theory, is experimental results that are conflicting and they give to different conclusions. This is the holy grail that you can find, because it's an interesting question and it has the need for some clarification. And if the data is out there, you don't need to do experiments, which is really cool.
I have a very annoying question for a physicist. That is, how conserved are these properties across species of plants?
Poof. Not even across the species of plants. And so your question is whether plants underproduce or overproduce across the species of plants?
Yeah, how different are these properties for different species of different plants?
A lot. In 2 slides, I'm going to show you that even for the same plants, they are very, very different. That is going to be my take-home message. This process is so complex that these kind of general trends are really hard to make. You really need a framework where you understand the process mechanistically. That is going to be my take-home message. Second one in 30 minutes. We're doing well. Okay, so we have these 2 frameworks, these 2 ways that people were thinking about this problem, one considering space, the other one considering biomass, but without space. I think it's very interesting to say, well, let's construct some framework in which I do have a space and I do have biomass, an especially explicit biomass allocation framework. And that's what we did. The model that I'm going to show you is in between elegant and embarrassing for a physicist and elegant for anyone else, in the sense that it's an extremely simple framework, and I'm going to show you how powerful extremely simple frameworks are that you can even solve when you were 14 or 13 years old. Well, 14 now, because derivatives we learn them when you are 16 or 17. If you know how to do a derivative, you know how to do everything I'm going to show. Okay, so let's try to model the root growth of our plant at a very, very, very high scale in terms of roots. So this model operates at a scale that is much larger than the scale that you were learning about in Veronica's lectures. I'm not going to even talk about a root branch. I'm going to talk about biomass. And I'm going to see how plants allocate biomass in space and I don't care whether it's thin roots. Well, I'm going to differentiate between thin and thick roots, but I don't care whether the tip branches here, there. It's an ecological model. It's like a population level model for a single plant, okay? Good. So I have my plant. Here is blue to make it easier. Processes in my model. I will have some input of water. I'm going to use water as an abuse, but it's a limiting resource. It can be nitrogen, phosphorus. It's a limiting resource. Let's say it's water. I have some resource loss at a constant rate delta, some exponential decay of my resources. I have some intake rate, so roots absorb resources, right? It makes sense. And I'm not even going to care about any functional response. Quadratic term, law of mass action. And now I told you that my model is going to be spatially explicit, and all I have so far doesn't have a space. So I need to account for a space. How I'm going to account for a space? In the simplest possible way. I'm just going to assume that plants, when they grow roots to exploit different soil patches, they need to pay an energetic cost that is associated to building and maintaining these roots. So this cost is going to be proportional to the square of the distance between the insertion point of the plant to the soil and the soil patch that they are trying to exploit. Why quadratic? This is a great question. It's a typical reviewer question. So we chose quadratic because in terms of biophysical arguments, is the way that you can ensure that the flows within your root are constant. But we also, because it's a very good reviewer question, we also had to put here a p and repeat our analysis with p between 1 and, I think, 9. So the reviewer was happy that these results didn't change. So as long as you have a monotonically growing function of the distance, everything works. The same way I'm going to show qualitatively. Okay, so with these mechanisms, these processes, it's kind of simple to write the equations that are going to govern the dynamics of the resource. So the change of resource in space and time is going to be a balance between the input, the loss, and the intake. Kind of easy. And then for the plant, I'm going to define a resource gain function that is basically going to be the balance between how much she's going to take from a given soil patch at a distance x and the cost that she has to pay for exploiting that patch. Very, very simple balance equation coupled to a dynamical equation for the water. All I'm going to show you is 1D, because that's also a very good reviewer question. We repeated analysis in 3D, and everything works. The patterns that you get for the roots are really cool, because then you get like these spheres that are deformed by the presence of the other plant. But it's the same. The physics is the same. The ecology is the same. And I'm not going to make you think about in 3D. Good. So what I told you that I wanted to do something that I can solve in a paper in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to take a further approximation, which is assuming that the resource dynamics is extremely fast, and therefore I'm going to assume that it's always at equilibrium. So this assumption basically means that whenever plants put resources in a given in a given soil patch, the water or the resource goes to equilibrium instantaneously. It has a much faster time scale. If you do that, you can basically write a closed equation for G, right? I just set this equal to 0. I obtain W at equilibrium. I plug it in this equation, and then I have a closed expression for G. If I am interested in which is the optimal root profile for a single plant, all I have to do is to calculate the derivative of this G function with respect to R at every point of space, and then I get my root profile as a function of space. The fact that this is a square root depends on the choice for the cost function and so on and so forth, the intakes. Again, the interesting thing, the important thing is that I think not surprisingly for anyone, I get a root profile in which plants allocate more roots close to their insertion point, and then they start allocating less and less roots until there is a critical point, if you want, or a limiting point, let's say, where it doesn't make any sense to allocate more roots because the cost outweighs the benefits, and therefore that's what sets the size of the root system. So with this very simple approach, I've been able to get an idea of how plants, when growing alone, could be allocating roots in the soil. And what is interesting is that it's a function, a simple function of my parameters. So I can get an understanding of basically everything. But this is not, I mean, okay, this is an interesting result. It's a nice way of building intuition, but we are interested in interactions, no? So we can extend the model to have 2 plants. With 2 plants, the model is going to be still very simple, but it's interesting because I have this, the fact that plants are far away from each other, it somehow breaks the symmetry of my problem, right? So it doesn't break the symmetry of my problem. It introduces a new symmetry, if you want. So if a plant wants to exploit, let's say, this patch of soil, of course, the orange guy is going to need less energy than the yellow one because it has to grow a lower roots, right? So now each point of the soil is going to be cheaper for one plant than for the other. And now we have a game. Now we have an interesting dynamics. How is it that, how much I'm willing to invade the territory of my neighbor to take resources from her so she doesn't grow too much and I am more comfortable in terms of how much I have to pay? This is a very interesting question, and it's a very, very interesting way of looking at how these plants may be interacting from an ecological point of view. The model now is a little bit more complicated, not too much, but a little bit. I just need to replace in the resource dynamics. Now, of course, I have a total density of roots, R1 and R2. And now, of course, I also need an equation from plant 2, where I need to account for the fact that she's displaced from the origin of coordinates at distance d. Anything else is the same. I can still keep my adiabatic approximation, and I get a system of 2 closed equations where I can do my math. But now it's very interesting. And now I want to stop a little bit to come back to something that Veronica said in her opening class on how can you use models in biology. Because it is very easy to think of models in biology as a tool to reproduce empirical patterns. And that's a very interesting use for models of biology. But here, what we can do, once I have the net resource gain function for the plant 1 and the plant 2, the orange and the yellow, I can also use my model to formulate a hypothesis and to make predictions of what would I expect if one thing or the other would be governing these interactions between plants. And then I can go to the lab and I can check where I am, no? So models in biology are also a very interesting way of proposing new experiments, establishing conversations between experiments and theory, and keep both sides of looking at complex questions working together. So quick question for you. I am talking too much and no questions. Which are the 2 hypotheses that you think you could formulate once you have these resource gain functions for the 2 plants? Any idea? No idea? No one wants free cake in a while? Okay, I'm going to give you the first hypothesis that we made. The first hypothesis that you can make is that these plants are extremely nice. They cooperate with each other. They exploit the resources in a way that the maximization condition for these resource gain functions is such that plants optimize the total resource gain of the population. So imagine that we need to share food between 2 of us. Maybe the nicest way of sharing it is to say, I take half, you take half, and that's it. I take the half that is closer to me, and you take the half that is closest to you, and we are okay. We can impose that optimization condition, and it will give us some root profiles in space that are the optimal solution given that optimization condition. But there is another alternative that is probably more realistic in the real world, that is that each plant is exploitative. So they try to take as much as they can, looking at what the other plant does, I'm going to do a strategy that maximizes my own resource gain. I'm going to exploit this resource brutally, and if you put 1 here, I don't care if it's not that good for me, I'm going to put 2, so you don't take more, and maybe I take a little bit, yeah, but if I don't do that, I would take a bit more, no? So those of you that are familiar with game theory, that's all what game theory does, trying to understand how these strategies lead to different equilibrium. Yes?
With cooperation, and to basically say that, okay, we think that there's going to be lesser food in the future, so we are going to optimize growth.
Going to be less effort in the future, in which sense? Sorry, I'm not sure if I got your question. That's why I'm trying to...
No, so they can be cooperative or exploitative, but also they might basically make decisions saying that, okay, this is the trend that we've seen with the resource availability, so I'm going to optimize my growth going forward so that if there is less of food in the future, I can still survive.
Yeah, that opens a lot of questions about plant strategies in fluctuating environments and how they germination times even before we go to the root allocation pattern. They could. In the model, we cannot account for that. Yeah. So this is the advantage. What I'm showing you is the advantages of simple models. Your question brings the problems of simple models, no? But the good thing of simple models is that you can complicate them slightly without losing track of. But yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so I told you, we have two possible hypotheses that give us two different optimization conditions of the net resource gain functions, and of course give us two different predictions for the root system. And these are the two predictions that these hypotheses give you. On the right, on my right, on your left, you have the prediction of the cooperative optimization, which is something I was already giving some hints before. I was spoiling myself a little bit. If plants cooperate, what makes sense is that they don't overlap at all. Why I'm going to enter into your foraging territory if there it's cheaper for you and more expensive for me? We just set a boundary at the midpoint between the two of us. Everything that goes to the left is for you, and everything that goes to the right goes for you. That's a cooperative way of exploiting resources that was, I don't know how fortunate this joke is, but was very famous in the 15th century with colonial countries, including my own. So it's cooperative for the exploiters, of course. And then we have the competitive hypothesis, where you see already a more interesting and a more complex pattern, right? There is some overlap. Plants tend to shrink. And here in blue, you see the solution for the solitary plant, whereas in orange, you see the solution for the plant in interaction. And you see that she's shrinking her root system as compared to the solitary one, just because of the presence of the yellow one. She's producing a lot more resources close to their insertion point. She's becoming very aggressive in exploiting resources close to herself. It's becoming like very defensive of a smaller territory. But there is still some overlap. So plants are still overlapping a little bit. This is already interesting. Both of these results are already interesting because both of them alienate with the spatial approach that I was mentioning before. Plants, when they are in interaction, they tend to reduce their overlap. But I told you that models as a tool to formulate hypotheses are only helpful if you can test them in experiments, no? And that's what we did. We went to Madrid, and we did experiments in a greenhouse where we were growing these plants, and these were pepper plants. And once they had grown, we planted them in different conditions. So basically, we did some planting experiments in which plants were not sharing the soil with neighbors. This is what you see here. But they were still at a given distance, so their above-ground systems were not interacting for resources, but still at the same distance as in the case I'm going to show you now. So basically, first realization of experiments, plants are growing alone. They have all the resources for them. They are good. Second realization of the experiments, we have the same pots for the plants, but now plants are sharing the soil. We did the experiments in a way that the above-ground systems are in the same conditions, both when plants are alone and when they are in below-ground interaction, just to make sure that we reduce the noise from the above-ground processes as much as possible. And here, plants are provided excellent conditions in terms of light and everything. So we designed the experiments in a way that the only limiting resource, if the experiment were perfect, was below-ground resources. So we allow them to grow, and once they grow, we needed a way to visualize the root system. And I told you that was experimentally very, very tricky. But we were very fortunate that Thiro, who was the main author of this study and the person that came up with the experimental setup, he found a way of doing that, and a way that I find is really cool. So basically what we did was we cut the plant, the stem of the plant, and we were, the order is different. That's why I was a bit confused. So basically we cut the stem of the plants and we injected ink into the plant with a lot of pressure, so the ink was percolating through the root system of the plants. And at the end of the day, what we had were that plants in interaction were either red or blue. The ones that had red ink injected into their stem were red, and the ones that had blue ink injected into their stem were blue. And at the end, that gives us a mass of roots, like a red-blue mass of roots, where we could basically chop it and construct a histogram. So this was kind of the same thing that the Jurassic Park folks used to do in the movie. We had the skeleton of the plant. We can construct different transects. We know where the insertion point of each plant is, and then we can construct a spatial profile of root density with experimental data. Oops. So once I have my spatial profile of roots, question is, which is the hypothesis? Well, question is the experiment validating any of the hypotheses? Quick answer is yes. If not, I would probably not be telling you this. That's how the scientific system works, sadly. Second question is, which of the hypotheses do you think would validate? Anyone want to make any guess? Someone that hasn't seen this before? No? Well, what we found is that the experimental data set validates the second hypothesis. So basically validates the idea that plants are more towards the exploitative end. And this is a point that I want to make. So when I say the exploitative strategy or the cooperative strategy in terms of modeling, that makes sense, A or B. In terms of real life, it's probably a continuum of strategies, if you want, whereas plants can become more cooperative or more exploitative, and you probably have signatures of both kind of behaviors, no? So this was very interesting, the fact that the plants were, the experimental data set was validating one of our hypotheses, but I still haven't figured out one of the questions that I told you I had, which was, how can we reconcile the biomass approach? Remember that I told you in the biomass approach, some people were finding that plants overproduce roots, and some people were finding that plants underproduce roots? We have a spatially explicit model, so maybe we can do something about that. And actually, we can. So now I have a spatial distribution of roots, and if I want to recover the biomass approach, all I have to do is to do an integral. I have to integrate my curve, right? Then I have the total biomass no matter where it is. I know how much biomass my plant is producing. Well, just to show you a little bit, well, I think I can skip this. So that's what we did. What you see now in the screen is the total biomass of roots that plants in interaction will allocate as a function of how far they are from each other. And this is a very interesting result. What we find is that when plants are very close, they tend to overproduce roots. That's why this line is above the integral of the solitary plant. The blue line is the solitary plant, and the orange one is the integral of the plant in interaction. But as plants start being farther away from each other, they start producing less and less and less and less resources. And our theory predicts that there is a shifting point beyond which plants underproduce roots when they are in interaction. So it is not that the spatial approach, some people were right and the other ones were wrong. It is that both were looking at different points in this curve. So when you look at the biomass and completely neglect the effect of space, the effect of the spatial patterns of roots, and now I'm fine because I said spatial patterns in my lecture, the results that you get are neglecting an important component of your system, and therefore you may be looking at partial information. And this is something that I found extremely interesting of our work, which was the fact that it was able to reconcile these, let's say, discrepancies in the literature. So any question up to here? Yes.
I was wondering, because you are using same species competing, isn't it?
Yes.
But in nature, we often have like competition between two different species. And when it happens, like in a rainforest, the plants often are contributing with each other. Like there is a lot of short cyclic plants and a lot of long cyclic plants. And the short cyclic plants are providing biomass for the ground and it makes all the two plants are doing well. Like, so there is an equilibrium between giving the space to other species that will provide me biomass, or just take all the ground. So
yeah, that's so one small comment to that question is that I said our model is extremely simple. So a very strong assumption of our model is that plants grow simultaneously, which is a very strong assumption. We took care of that in the experiments, but we assume that plants, they grow at the same time. We also don't take into account above ground biomass. That opens a very interesting extension of the model where you need to introduce these trade-offs between above ground and below ground. But going to Yago's question straight away, that's an interesting question. It's so interesting that the next half of my talk is about it, okay?
Okay.
Yeah, so paraphrasing Yago, nature has more than competition out there. And sometimes, very often, plants of different species are close to each other. And then the question that we had is, well, can we use our framework to study how different interactions between plants may take place in different ecological contexts? And we found a specific question that was very interesting for us, which was, how is that interactions that in nature are stable, but theory predicts them to be unstable? For example, these kind of opportunistic cooperator interactions, and I don't want to abuse about game theoretical jargon because I don't think it's the best way of phrasing these things, but basically interactions in which one of the plants provides resources that are exploited by other plants. How is that interactions can become ecologically stable? And we extended our model to take into account that. So now the orange plant is gonna be what I call opportunistic, and the yellow one is gonna be a soil engineering plant. And the idea is that both of them are able to intake resources, but the yellow one is gonna carry a trait in her root system that is able to make resources available for anyone else. You can think, for instance, as the soil engineering plant having some mining trait that allows, for instance, to mobilize some type of nutrient in the soil, for example. This is a very interesting scenario because carrying this trait is costly, it's energetically costly, of course. It provides more resources, so it may give a benefit, but it provides a benefit that you have to share with neighbors, because once you mobilize, for example, phosphorus in the soil, it's out there, so anyone can take it. I'm going to go very quickly through this because I don't want to take the whole time. But basically, you can extend your equations. Now they are a little bit trickier because the resource dynamics is more complex. It's non-linear on the resource trait mining, which is this phi here. So this is the main difference in the resource dynamics equation that basically accounts for the fact that whenever you have engineering roots, the amount of resources is going to increase, no? So the resources has this positive feedback with the engineering roots, and at some point it saturates with the amount of roots that the mining plant allocates. And then, of course, the net resource gain functions are the same I had before, but now for my engineering plant, I have an additional energetic cost, meaning that the more roots I produce, the more cost I have to pay because I carry this trait with me. The way you solve these equations is the same. I'm sorry, this is just how the positive feedback looks like. So this is how the available resource increases as a function of the mining intensities, how this function looks like for those of you that haven't seen this function before because you missed Johan's lecture last week. Anyway, now the optimization problem becomes a little bit more complicated. I need to take into account this mining resource as well. I have a mining trait, and therefore trying to understand which are the optimal strategies is a more complicated problem. That means that I cannot do math anymore. I have to do optimization numerically, but still possible, and compared with the stuff that many of you guys probably do with your computers is not that hard. And I should update my slides. This is already available, so if you are interested, I can share with you the PDF. Anyway, what we found is that if you look at the okay, let me go slowly here. So what I am taking into account with this positive feedback between the roots of the engineering plant and the available resource that I'm going to call I of phi, what I'm taking into account with this positive feedback is to the fact that whenever the engineering plant is not present in the system, the amount of resources has a minimum value, omega b. Right? We all agree with that. And then what I'm saying is that as the engineering plant arrives to the ecosystem, then the amount of available resources starts increasing until it saturates at a maximum value. So I want to stop a little bit with this function because it's containing most of the information that I'm going to be interested in when I want to look at this strategy. On the one hand, this difference here gives me how much resources I can extract from the ecosystem by engineering it, right? If without engineering plants, my baseline is here, then there is a little bit that I can gain. But if I start from very low, I can extract a lot of resources. So this gives me an idea of the potential of improvement that my ecosystem has, the mining potential that I call here. Then the way I model this positive feedback also tells me how fast this plant, the mining plant, is able to improve the environment. And that's going to be given by the phi parameter, how much she invests. If she invests a lot, if her mining rate is a lot, then introducing very few roots is going to increase the environmental quality a lot, but it's also going to carry a huge cost for her. So basically the idea here is that the plant needs to optimize the value of her phi, taking into account that putting a huge phi is going to give her a lot of resources very quickly with very few roots, but it's also going to carry a high cost for her. So there is a trade-off here between mining allocation and how much you can extract from the environment. That's why I'm going to use the B parameter here as the indicator of environmental quality, how good my environment is without roots, and I'm going to use phi as the mining trade that I'm going to optimize. And that's why here, wow, what happened? That's why here you see this heat map with these two parameters in the x and y axis. So basically, what you see now in the screen is that for any combination of phi and b, the total plant gain is going to take a value, and there is a line, there is a curve at which this total plant gain is maximum, which is the optimal value for this resource mining trade. Is there any question up to here? Because this is important if you want to understand this extension. No? Okay. So a few interesting observations are that when the environment is very poor, is very bad, so B is very low, there is a range of resource mining traits at which this total plant gain is 0, or negative, it doesn't matter, 0, let's say. Which means that if the environment is this bad, plants, the only way plants have to survive is by mining resources in the soil. That means that in these very bad conditions, mining resources in the soil is obligatory for survival. And that's why, for example, when you have, that's why, sorry, let me tone it down a little bit. That could be why when you have poor soils, for example, after volcanic eruptions, as we have in the Canary Islands, the first plants that colonize those environments are plants that do have those traits, because they are able to improve the soil conditions by establishing in the ecosystem. Then when the environmental resources, the environmental conditions improve, that's not obligatory anymore. And for those of you that have a background in ecology, this may resonate with ideas related to ecological succession, for example. I go faster than these slides. Anyway, this idea of how the optimal mining trait changes across an environmental gradient opens very interesting questions about in which conditions carrying this mining trait is optimal when I have plants surrounding me. When you're alone is fine. Anything You introduce there, you're gonna, anything you extract from the soil is gonna be for you. So it's just optimizing your own resource income. But when you have another plant that is not contributing to this mining process, the problem is a little bit more complicated. So as I told you, we were interested in looking at when these plant interactions are stable, depending on the environmental conditions. The way of looking at that is usually by defining these indexes where you calculate the fitness of a planted interaction with the fitness of a solitary plant in a given environmental condition. And this index basically, whenever it's positive, it means that plants in interaction do better than when they are alone, which means that plants are helping each other. And when this index is negative, means that plants do worse when they are in interaction than when they are alone, meaning that they are competing. So basically, the key idea here is that as I move across an environmental gradient, a value of B, the amount of resources that I can extract from the soil by mining is smaller because there are more that are available out there. So it makes less and less sense to invest in releasing them because they are already there. So why would I release resources and spend energy if they are already there? So there should be at some point in which it doesn't make any sense to continue mining resources because I just do fine without doing that and I don't need to invest that energy. That is the intuition. So what we found after performing all the numerical analysis of the model, and if you are interested in details, I can give them to you, what we found was indeed that. So basically, we can divide the values of B that we were showing before in different regions. So first, we have one region where, as I told you, was completely necessary to do mining. If you don't do mining, you don't survive. But then, when the environment gets a little bit better, the combination of the resources that are available and the mining of your neighbor allow you to colonize the environment. And that's when new plants can arrive to these environments. Those scenarios are very interesting, is what you see here between in the region 2. They are very interesting because plants that are mining resources, they are releasing resources to the exterior, and the plants that don't produce them, they are next to them, and they are also taking those resources. So we have one plant that is creating food for anyone, and another plant that is not creating food, but is taking it. That's a dilemma that people interested, for example, in evolutionary dynamics have studied quite a lot, in which the question is, how is that I will invest energy into creating resources if there is neighbors around me exploiting it? So the answer that we can give with this model that describes the dynamics of the resource is that even though the mining plant is producing resources and it has exploiters that are taking them, she is still getting a positive benefit from doing that. That is the message here. And maybe I went too fast, and you can ask questions and I can elaborate on my argument. But that is the key idea here. The key idea here is that by setting up this theoretical framework in which we can ask different questions and obtain the different solutions, I can understand in which conditions it makes sense that this interaction between one provider of resources and one exploiter of resources lead to different types of interactions. So when it is that if I produce n units of resource, even though you are taking 2 from me, it's still fine for me to produce because, okay, fine, I don't take it all, but I still take more than if I were not doing that. And that stabilizes these mining traits in this specific system and more generally these antagonistic interactions in plant communities. So something that we were trying to do now that is a little bit of a crazy idea, but I think it's fun, is to, well, some of these questions where you already did them, make them, sorry. We discussed some of them, but the one that I think is more interesting for the topics of the school is how can I go beyond 2 plants? Can I study patterns with this more mechanistic description of how plants grow? That's something we are trying to do. It's David's work, where we are trying to make this model dynamic and try to look at how it is that when I have a patch of 2-dimensional soil, different plants will grow in space, will interact with each other, will establish different root architectures, and how is that this will look like in terms of the spatial pattern of vegetation. This takes me back to my initial question on how many plants do I have in a single spot, and also opens new questions related to how much above ground and below ground biomass different spatial configurations of plants would have depending on the environmental stresses, for example, they are subject to. This is a really hard problem because we need to account for above ground biomass, we need to introduce trade-offs. Plants are growing asynchronously, so it basically brings all the limitations that you guys were asking before. If you are interested in this question, we can talk more about that, and probably you should also talk to David, who is the one, you probably know, surely, you have to talk to David, who is the one that knows how things work with this problem. I only know that the patterns are pretty. So of course, this been a considerable amount of work for the last 6 years. It's a very interesting, there is a very interesting behind this that also brings some of the things we discussed in the roundtable, that if you allow me, I would like to take the license to tell you briefly over 3 minutes. So this is a collaboration with Ciro, who is now in Rey Juan Carlos in Spain, in Madrid. Gabriel, who was a postdoc working with me here in ICTP-SAIFR, he's now working as a data analyst in a company. And also Aurora, who was she was a student in Madrid, and she was the one responsible for the experiment. Fernando Valladares, who is a full professor in Spain, working in the CSIC, and Steve Pacala, who was a Ciro supervisor in Princeton. So Ciro is now in Rey Juan Carlos in Spain, but he was a PhD student in Princeton when we started this project. Our scientific interests were as far as me being interested in vegetation patterns and he being interested in root physiology and root interactions. But we had something that I think is more important than scientific interest in common, that is that Ciro is from Madrid and I'm from Galicia. So yeah, we were a little bit, I don't know, you always look for people that are close to you in many aspects. And we started discussing over a beer hour. So our department in Princeton had a beer hour, which I think is the most important thing in departments. And we started talking about which of us, what each of us was doing. Ciro had this idea to do experiments. He had never seen a differential equation. I have seen a couple of differential equations. I had never seen a root. So we started discussing, setting up the theory, setting up the experiments, and it's led to a significant amount of interesting publications in different journals, and more importantly, to many, many trips to Madrid, where we could enjoy, which for me is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. But the story is that sometimes interactions happen randomly. They follow the law of mass action with some bias, and it gives to very, very nice science. This paper saved my postdoc, so and allowed me to have a job after. So we just take that into account. And also, of course, there is a lot of funding from Brazil and from Germany. And if you have any question, I'm super happy to take it. And thank you.